Welcome back again to Come and See Inspirations. My name is John Keeley. Shane Ambers, of course, is still with us on the end of the Skype line. And joining us this morning, a very special guest who's been on the programme a few times, Fr Eamon Conway. Good morning to Fr Eamon.
Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here.
Thanks, Fr Eamon, for joining us. Fr Eamon's going to join us this morning specifically to help us to reflect on John Henry Newman, who is being ordained, who's been canonised this morning in Rome as we speak. So, Fr Eamon, John Henry Newman, where would you like to start?
I'd like to start, I suppose, a little bit back, just in case, just for our listeners, it might be helpful just to think for a moment about why saints at all, why canonise saints. And it's interesting that Pope Francis, although he's only, a pontiff for going on 6 years, he has canonized canonised almost twice as many saints as Pope John Paul II did in his 27-year pontificate. Pope Francis has actually canonised 838 saints, John Paul II 482, and then in the interim years, Pope Benedict canonised 45 saints. So let's take it that Pope Francis is big into saints. And in a document he brought out last year called Gaudete et Exultate on the universal call to holiness. And I would certainly encourage our listeners, they'll find it on the internet, hopefully they'll find it in a bookshop, they'll find it on the back of the church. It's a lovely little call to all of us to realise and recognise our own call to holiness. And in that he talks about, in a sense, the ordinariness of holiness. That holiness is encountered and experienced in our daily struggles, in our daily attempts to be faithful, not just only to God, but also to God in our brother and sister. Just a brief quote, he says, "I like to contemplate the holiness present in the patience of God's people, in parents who raise their children with immense love, in men and women who work hard to support their families, in the sick, in elderly religious who never lose their smile. In their daily perseverance, I see the holiness of the Church. Very often it is the holiness found in our next-door neighbours, those who, living in our midst, reflect God's presence." And as we contemplate somebody like John Henry Newman, who is distant from us culturally because he, was an Englishman, distant from us in time because he lived between 1801 and 1899, distant from us even in the style of his writing at times, even his English, which is beautiful prose, but can be difficult enough to stick with and to follow. We might feel at some level distant from him, but what I like to ponder about Newman and what makes me feel very close to him is his own story of faith and his own story of struggle and how he tried to, recognise and how he came to recognise God in the ordinariness of his everyday life. I mean, for example, we can pick up the story, I suppose, when Newman was a teenager, when he was 15 years of age, away at boarding school, spending quite a bit of time during the summer there because his parents had a financial collapse and it was a difficult time for him to be at home, so he was kept there over the summer. You can imagine, in a sense, no teenager likes to be singled out and treated differently, but he was left there. And he was a very bright and you might even say precocious teenager, and he was reading a lot, and he was reading, as we now know, atheistic philosophy. He was testing, in a sense, whatever traditional upbringing he had, as teenagers tend to do. But he found these atheistic philosophers wanting. They raised all the right questions, but they didn't seem to be providing what he saw as credible answers. But at least he was prepared to test his faith. And many, many years later, and I think this is a very important line for us in Ireland, in the context of faith and faith journeys today. Many years later, he wrote, he said, "An unquestioned faith among those who are capable of a questioning faith is, to say the least, dangerous and inconsistent." And so, Newman tested his faith. He put the tough questions to his own faith, and he found many answers within his tradition lacking, but he also found the answers of atheistic philosophers lacking. And then he had a good mentor, an Anglican priest who worked at the college where he was, pointed him in the direction of how to read the scriptures. And he gradually went through what can really happen, and we need to believe this can happen for ourselves. He went through a deep personal conversion, one that stuck with him for the rest of his life. And there were various moments, and usually moments of vulnerability, moments of weakness were moments of faith. So in that time of being away from home and the isolation and the loneliness and the worry, anxiety about his family, he also had ill health. And he went through many different times in his life, in fact, when he suffered from ill health. And these were also moments where there was the invitation to surrender and to trust in God's faith. So that's where I would begin to talk about John Henry Newman, rather than, and we can go on to it, but rather than go on to talk about his great intellectual contribution to the life of the church.
Thanks, Father Eamon. Shane, would you like to just make a comment on that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, because I as Eamon said, I was looking and kind of reading around John Henry Newman myself, and I suppose when I said to someone that we were interviewing Father Eamon this week about John Henry Newman, the question I got back was, well, why should Irish Catholics be interested in English saints? And I said, well, first of all, he's a saint, as Eamon said, for the church, and I said there is an Irish connection after all. I said he did help to start the Catholic University in Ireland, which then became UCD. But Eamon, I suppose there's a couple of things about the life of John Henry that are kind of interesting, and I suppose it's his interaction with the faith and his interrogation of the faith and his journey in faith, which I suppose was the thing that most caught my eye. Because like you said, at 15, engaging and asking the questions, and then he moving on in terms of he went up to Oxford to study there, and became part of the Oxford movement. But and the whole thing that in terms of his interaction with the faith, he was actually quite the way it was described where I read it, he was kind of Calvinistic actually in his approach, as he was actually ordained for the Anglican Church.
That's right. He ministered. He ministered very, very fervently and very enthusiastically in the Anglican Church, and the Anglicans can also claim him, and to some extent, I suppose, celebrate his accomplishments and celebrate his achievements as well. But at some point, the integrity, and I mean that in the technical sense of the wholeness of the Roman Catholic faith, just became utterly compelling for him in terms of its rationality and its truth. And again, if you want to learn something from Newman, you want one takeaway from Newman, it was this utter, unabashed commitment to truth. And he felt obliged in conscience, which is a very, very important word for Newman. He felt obliged in conscience to follow the truth and be faithful to the truth. So it was a conversion at that level that is a takeaway from. So when you ask the question, it's a very good question. Why should we be interested in an English saint? First of all, exactly. Well, it's all about us. Actually, it's not about the saints. For Pope Francis, holds these people before us simply to be aids to us on our own path to holiness. And how I find, just to be very personal about it for a moment, I find Newman, I've had a bit of a health challenge myself in the last few weeks, which thankfully has gone well. But I was trying to reflect on Newman in that context and pray with him some of his beautiful, beautiful prayers. He's a lovely prayer about how every aspect of our lives can be turned to God's service, including our vulnerability and our weakness. So I take great enrichment from that, but I also take great enrichment from what you've just been talking about now, which was his ruthless, in a sense, pursuit of truth. And it got him into trouble. I mean, again, another takeaway from me was his extraordinary courage in what we would now today call the public square. It took a lot out of him, but he did not shirk from speaking truth in very challenging ways that actually, in one instance, led to a major libel case against him, which he lost, actually, on a technicality, which can happen. But he followed the dictates of his conscience and that's also what led him to convert from Anglicanism to the Roman Catholic faith.
One of the things that I was curious about was his was very much, I suppose, how will I put this? It was very much an intellectual discovery for him in terms of his faith, in one sense. And I love that expression you said there, the ruthless pursuit of truth. And I think for me, that's actually something which I hadn't thought about before, because often in modern culture and in modern conversation, you have this false dichotomy that's put out there between faith and reason, in that, to be a person of faith, it somehow implies that you're less logical or you're less rational because you're a person of faith. And I think maybe that's something that maybe John Henry Newman can offer in terms of the modern conversation that they're trying to have, where you're trying to engage and create a space in the public square for that kind of a conversation.
So one of the challenges we face in contemporary culture is a narrowed understanding of what actually we mean by reason. I mean, we may also have a defective understanding of what we mean by faith, which is about trusting. Fundamentally, it's about letting go into the mystery of God. But when it comes to reason, many people are working out of a very narrow, shrunken version of reason. So for them, something is only reasonable if we can touch it or taste it or smell it. In other words, it's something perceptible to the senses. If it's something that seems terribly logical. And that's an aspect of truth. Of course, logic, faith can never and should not attempt to contradict logic. But we know that there are much, much deeper truths than that. I mean, how do you know with any degree of certainty, for example, what is rational about love? I mean, certainly it's reasonable to love, but there's more to love than reason. And Pascal, of course, famously said, the heart has reason, the reason does not understand. So we can have a very narrow understanding of reason. And what I like about Newman is he challenges that, and that's a legacy. And if people are wondering what's a takeaway from Newman, he was facing that culture at the beginnings, in the sense of the movement where that reason was being truncated and narrowed. He was challenging that. And so, for example, he said, we do not see the truth at once and make towards it, but we fall upon and try error and find it is not the truth. We grope about by touch, not by sight. And so by a miserable experience, exhaust the possible modes of acting till naught is left but truth remaining. Such is the process by which we succeed. A beautiful line, we walk to heaven backwards. We drive our hours at a mark and think him most skillful whose shortcomings are the least. So there's nothing irrational, there's nothing unreasonable about groping after the truth. That's the nature of life, actually. And truth is not to be identified with certainties. You can be certain about something, be certainly wrong.
Yeah, true.
They're very different things. So what I like about Newman too is, and for me, the two aspects hold together. I talked a lot earlier, and I do think it's hugely important. It was his own sense of fragility and vulnerability, both because of his family circumstances. For example, his brother became an atheist and never spoke to him. His sister died suddenly, and he grieved for the rest of his life that he never got to say a proper goodbye to her. He lost a lot of his friends when he converted to Catholicism, who didn't really want anything to do with him anymore. He had ill health. I mean, talk about work-life balance, something he never understood, really. He used to work 17, 18 hours a day, often standing at his desk, and then would crash, would burn out for a while. And yes, somehow God could be at work in this man. And I actually think that the two hold together, that it's in our vulnerability that we're open to perceive what is true in a way that sometimes in our arrogance that we are not. And Pope Francis, this is why Pope Francis, I think, finds Newman attractive, because Pope Francis has always invited us to be in touch with those who are on the margins, to those who don't have the luxury of the arrogance of a lot of our discourse about so-called reason, but actually have to live faced with the harsh realities that open them up to what is true and what is just and what is pure in life.
There are so many areas that you could talk about with Newman. So, for example, his discovery of, for example, the Church Fathers and Mothers and that contribution to his faith journey. There's also his contribution to, for example, the founding of the University College Dublin or the Catholic University of Ireland, and his writings on the whole role and area of education and what is education. But I suppose one other area which is sometimes where Newman, if you like, is brought into, I won't say disrepute, so to speak, but sometimes his views and writings on conscience and freedom of conscience can sometimes be kind of confused. And I suppose the context for this was the First Vatican Council, where papal infallibility was declared. And of course, there was the whole thing in English conversation and English discourse, in where how could you be loyal to the Pope and an English true to the crown or true Englishman, and that whole conversation. And there's a famous letter, I understand, Father Eamon, to the Duke of Norfolk, which deals with this whole area.
Yes, I mean, again, as I said earlier, that Newman was at times to his cost, to his personal cost, ruthless when it came to defending truth and defending the role of conscience, which was completely exonerated in Vatican II, where we are told, and indeed Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, very much defends this understanding of conscience too, as conscience is that secret sanctuary within each one of us, where we are alone with God, and where each one of us is judged by nobody and no one person, not even the Pope, not even our understanding of anything else other than our by God, and we're before God. So, in a sense, Newman, there was really no. He was simply, I suppose, articulating that it's a false contradiction, because, of course, the Pope, also had to be a defender of conscience and so on. But where people were somehow misunderstanding the intention behind papal infallibility, and it was open to misunderstanding, and many, many important people in the Church at the time questioned not necessarily the content of that decree on papal, but the wisdom of it. So, for example, I'm a priest of the Tuam Diocese, and Archbishop McHale, who was the Archbishop of Tuam at the time, famously said that he saw absolutely no need for the doctrine of papal infallibility, because in his diocese every parish priest already considers himself infallible.
That's very good.
So it wasn't so much but what Newman was doing was recentering that what is at the heart of Catholic faith is truth and conscience, of which the Pope is also a servant, fundamentally a servant. Can I just bring you back, because
Sure.
you mentioned it there, and I think it's very important, to the issue of Catholic education. I mean, I cite Newman all the time, and his ideas were quite profound and still are profound. Unfortunately, they've also been hijacked by many people claiming the mantle of Newman. I mean, what Newman was against was what we call the instrumentalization of education, putting education at the service of anything other than the whole total development of the human person. And unfortunately, I mean, that's in my view, our biggest challenge in the Irish educational system at the moment. I mean, where even we now are doing things like computer coding or whatever else in primary school. We're teaching kids about how to be entrepreneurs, rather than open up for the joy of education. My aunt a few years ago died in her 90th year, and she was able, with a little bit of support from, I found I forget the name of the textbook, that had those lovely, beautiful poems. But those beautiful poems she would have learned as a child stood to her. Poems that understood the reality of death and spoke about the reality of death, which many of our listeners may well have learned as well. They're all gone, or many of them are gone. And we have a very functional education system, which is all about outputs. I mean, recently, Archbishop Rowan Williams, the Anglican Archbishop, now retired of Canterbury, he said that in the UK, we have to justify giving kids, hungry kids, poor kids, hungry kids, school dinners, on the basis of research that shows that it improves their performance in the classroom. And actually, only a few weeks ago, that was actually proposed here by a government minister, and there was research produced and was discussed in the media here. If you look it up, you'll find it. So this is exactly what Newman was against. He was defending what he called a liberal education, an education which, if it was put at the service of anything other than the holistic development of the child, of the young man, of the young woman, was a betrayal of what education was really about. Now, he really tried to bring that to bear on the establishment of a Catholic university in Ireland, and it floundered, and it fell apart. Largely, unfortunately, and this has been very well documented, we're talking about 150 years ago, but it's well documented, because the Irish bishops couldn't work together.
Oh, there's a surprise.
Yeah, well, this is it. And I'm afraid I'm wondering what the if in the era before emails and freedom of information and GDPR, 150 years ago, we had excellent records of the failures and the names attached to the failures of who didn't do what when to get a Catholic university off the ground. We'll have very good records now because we are also in danger now of losing, a really Catholic presence in our education system here in Ireland.
Father Eamon, I'm afraid I have to draw this conversation to a close. So as we said today in Rome, Pope Francis is canonizing John Henry Newman, formerly UCD, connected with Catholic University of Ireland, English saint. He would be the fifth Londoner to be canonised. And from an Irish perspective, we are being represented actually in Rome this morning by Bishop Brendan Leahy and a number of pilgrims from the Limerick Diocese who will be attending the canonisation ceremony with a number of the other Irish bishops. And they'll be in very good company because I understand that Prince Charles is leading a delegation of about 15 people from the United Kingdom to mark the occasion today in Rome. So, Father Eamon Conway, it's a pleasure as always to have you on the programme. Thank you very much for this morning for joining us and helping us to explore the life and times and the contribution of who is now Saint John Henry Newman.
Thank you very much indeed.
Now, Father Conway, you are going to join us, stay with us for the Gospel reflection, please? Would you be able
I can do that, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so just before we go for our second piece of music, we'll now take our second piece of music, and of course we can only really play one piece of music, Lead Kindly Light by the Arundel Cathedral Choir, written by John Henry Newman. So please join us again in part 3 where we read and reflect on the Word of God.